Every year, like clockwork, the Nile would flood, soaking the land in nutrient-rich silt. This predictable cycle turned barren desert into fertile farmland, allowing Egypt to thrive in a place where, logically, no great civilization should have existed. It fed millions, it sustained empires, and most importantly, it gave birth to the belief that the gods favored Egypt. Their word was law, their image carved into stone and preserved for eternity. Under their rule, ancient Egypt pioneered advances in medicine, astronomy, architecture, and mathematics that would remain unmatched for centuries. Out of this life-giving river rose a kingdom unlike any other. The pyramids of Giza weren't just tombs, they were statements, monuments to eternity. Every figure told a story, every symbol carried power. They told the world, we are not afraid of time. Pharaohs ruled with absolute power, not merely as kings, but as living embodiments of the divine. They performed brain surgeries, they mapped the stars, they constructed temples so perfectly aligned with celestial events that modern engineers still marvel at them. And then there was their art, their language. Hieroglyphs weren't just writing, they were living symbols, etched with reverence into every wall, every tomb, every statue. This was a civilization obsessed with the afterlife, one that believed that death was not an end, but a continuation. That obsession led to a legacy of mummification, tomb building, and spiritual systems so complex that they're still being decoded today. By the time of the New Kingdom, Egypt had become an empire stretching its influence into Nubia, the Levant, and beyond. Gold flowed into the country. Tribute poured in. Egypt's military was strong, its culture dominant, its gods feared by foreign nations. It was the apex of what a human civilization could be in the ancient world. The very systems that supported Egypt's divine monarchy, dependence on the Nile, priestly power would later contribute to its unraveling. But as with all empires, greatness casts a long shadow. The gods, once believed eternal, would fall silent, and the empire that dared to defy time itself would learn that even eternity has a limit. And so, we begin our descent. The Nile, once so giving, would one day betray them. Civilizations rise with nature, but they also fall with it. For thousands of years, the Nile had been Egypt's silent partner, predictable, generous, sacred. Its annual flood was more than a natural event, it was a divine promise. But what happens when that promise is broken? Somewhere around 1200 BCE, the rhythm of the Nile began to falter. Scientists analyzing ancient sediments discovered evidence of long-term droughts, triggered by changes in climate and possibly massive volcanic eruptions as far away as Iceland. The sky grew stingy, the rain stopped, and the Nile, once mighty, shrank into a sluggish ribbon. Imagine granaries once overflowing with wheat, now filled with dust, markets silent, children crying in the streets, desperation etched into every face. To the Egyptians, this wasn't just bad weather, it was a cosmic betrayal. Without the annual inundation, the fields dried up, crops failed, starvation crept across the land like a shadow. But famine didn't just hurt stomachs, it tore at the fabric of society. The pharaohs, weakened by years of internal strife, could do little to restore order, and all the while, outside Egypt's borders, hungry eyes were watching. As the people suffered, faith in the pharaohs began to crumble. There's even evidence of tsunami-like events along the Nile Delta. Night, once Egypt's protector, now seemed hell-bent on its destruction. How could the gods' chosen rulers allow such misery? The divine automat, the sacred balance of the world, was unraveling. Chaos, or Isfit, the force Egypt feared above all else, had returned. And it wasn't just drought. Massive earthquakes rocked the eastern Mediterranean, toppling cities and damaging temples. The priests who interpreted the gods' will offered no solutions. As food became scarce and leadership grew fragile, waves of migrants and raiders, possibly displaced by the same environmental disasters, began to push into Egyptian territory. These included the mysterious Sea Peoples, a confederation of seafaring raiders who devastated entire civilizations across the Mediterranean. The legendary pharaoh Ramses III fought them off in a massive naval battle, but at a cost. The war strained Egypt's economy and exposed its vulnerabilities. Even the mighty Hittites fell before them. Egypt barely survived. So now, Egypt wasn't just starving, it was bleeding. Internal records, like the famous Harris Papyrus, speak of unrest, corruption, and a state barely holding together. Meanwhile, The people wrote desperate pleas on scraps of stone and broken pottery messages to the gods, asking why they had been abandoned. Nature had once been Egypt's greatest ally, but in the end, it proved to be the first and most merciless executioner. What happens when an empire too weak to feed itself must face swords at its borders? And as the earth turned against them, Egypt's enemies were preparing their final moves. Even the strongest walls collapse when the cracks are ignored. While drought and famine weakened the body of Egypt, something far more insidious was corroding its hot political decay. And unlike a failed harvest, this rot came from within. You see, Egypt's strength had always relied on one simple belief, that the pharaoh was divine. More than a king, he was the living god, the earthly voice of Mawat order incarnate. But after Ramses III, a slow and chaotic decline began. In fact, by the end of the New Kingdom, the priests of Amun owned nearly 1/3 of all Egyptian land. Temples functioned like kingdoms within kingdoms, collecting taxes, commanding labor, even maintaining their own armies. Power became fragmented. Pharaohs were no longer chosen for strength or vision but manipulated by palace officials, military commanders, but when nature betrayed the land and suffering grew unbearable, people began to question the divine. And with that single question, the entire political structure began to crumble. It was systemic. Ancient documents, like the strike papyrus, record one of history's first labor strikes workers at Deir el-Medina demanding the grain rations they were owed. The New Kingdom, Egypt's final golden age, had produced legendary rulers Hatshepsut Akhenaten, Ramses the Great. The priesthood of Amun, once loyal servants of the crown, had grown rich, powerful, and dangerously autonomous. Foreign powers were preparing to strike, and this time there would be no Ramses to hold the line. In the north, a pharaoh; in the south, a high priest with just as much authority. Egypt had fractured into pieces, and when a kingdom is divided, it's no longer a kingdom. In essence, Egypt had two governments, one spiritual, one royal, and they were no longer cooperating. They were competing. Civil war soon followed. During the Third Intermediate Period, rival dynasties rose across Egypt, often ruling simultaneously. Even worse, the throne itself became a revolving door. Some pharaohs ruled for mere months. Others came to power through intrigue, assassination, or foreign manipulation. Dynasty followed, dynasty often weak, often short-lived, and always struggling to assert control. This constant instability made it nearly impossible to respond to Egypt's larger crisis: environmental collapse, economic distress, and growing threats from beyond its borders. Meanwhile, the people were growing disillusioned. Tomb robbing became widespread not just by common thieves, but even by government officials desperate for gold. Corruption wasn't hidden. The old order was broken. No longer was Egypt the unshakable stone colossus of the ancient world. It had become fragile, fragmented, and vulnerable. And as Egypt's leaders fought over crumbling thrones and hollow temples, a new danger loomed on the horizon, one that didn't come from the heavens or the Nile, but from beyond its borders. When the lion grows weak, the jackals circle. For centuries, Egypt was the envy of the ancient world, rich in gold, knowledge, and prestige. But by the first millennium BCE, Egypt had lost its bite. The empire that once pushed its armies deep into Canaan and Nubia could now barely defend its own borders. Each new conqueror didn't just claim land, they claimed Egypt's legacy, its power, its soul, and the world had noticed. Ironically, the people Egypt had once conquered rose to conquer Egypt itself. The Kushite pharaohs of the 25th dynasty tried to rekindle Egypt's greatness, building temples, enforcing religious orthodoxy, even fighting off external threats. But they, too, were short. Egypt's slow political collapse opened the floodgates for wave after wave of foreign invasions. First came the Libyans, once hired as mercenaries in the Egyptian army. They slowly gained influence until they no longer served the pharaoh. The Libyan dynasties ruled parts of Egypt during the Third Intermediate Period, blending their culture with Egyptian tradition but never quite restoring the old power. And when they came with iron weapons, siege machines, and a reputation for merciless destruction. The Egyptians, tired of Persian rule, welcomed him with open arms. He founded the city of Alexandria, which would become a beacon of science, culture, and philosophy. But make no mistake, this was not a rebirth of Egyptian greatness. It was a transformation. In 671 BCE, they invaded and took Memphis. Pharaoh Taharqa fled. Egypt had fallen under foreign rule yet again. Then came the Kushites kings from Nubia in the south, because on the eastern horizon, a far more brutal force was approaching. The Assyrians, her desperate fight to restore Egypt's independence, would become legendary. But it would also mark the end of Egypt itself. The Assyrians were not interested in cultural integration or restoration. They were and it wouldn't be the last time. Shortly after the Assyrians came the Persians. Under Cambyses II, the Persian Empire absorbed Egypt into its vast dominion in 525 BCE. Egypt was now just another satrapia province under the rule of a distant king. Each invading force chipped away at the myth of the divine pharaoh. The gods were silent, the temples looted. The once mighty nation had become a prize passed from empire to empire. Though the Persians allowed Egyptians to keep many of their traditions, real power had shifted irrevocably. This repeated foreign domination did more than humiliate Egypt. It altered its very identity. But Egypt's final breath as an independent power came with the arrival of a new, unstoppable force. The Greeks. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great marched into Egypt not as a destroyer, but as a liberator. After Alexander's death, his general Ptolemy seized control of Egypt and founded the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of Greek-speaking rulers who would govern for nearly 300 years. By this point, Egypt was no longer truly Egyptian. And as we turn to the last chapter in this saga, we meet a queen whose story still echoes today. Sometimes, the final chapter isn't a battle, it's a slow fade into someone else's story. By the time Cleopatra VII rose to power in 51 BCE, Egypt was already a shadow of its former self. It had been centuries since an Egyptian pharaoh truly ruled. The pyramids were ancient, even then worn by time, their builders long forgotten. She portrayed herself as the reincarnation of Isis, the mother goddess. And more than anything, she fought for Egypt's independence, for its dignity, and for its survival. What remained was a legacy wrapped in gold, myth, and illusion. But Cleopatra was different. Unlike her Greek ancestors in the Ptolemaic line, Cleopatra embraced Egyptian culture. She spoke the language. She worshipped the gods. After his assassination, she turned to Mark Antony, forging a powerful but fragile bond that would define her final years. Together, they tried to carve out a future one where Egypt could still stand tall, independent from Rome's grasp. But she wasn't just fighting enemies, she was fighting history. Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE marked the official end of pharaonic Egypt. With her fall, Egypt was absorbed into the Roman Empire as a province. The once mighty Nile kingdom became Rome's breadbasket, fertile land stripped of its spirit. There would be no more pharaohs, no more independence. She was the last to wear the crown of the pharaohs, the final voice of a civilization that had once commanded the ancient world. Rome had grown into a superpower, hungry for territory, resources, and control. And Egypt, with its endless grain supply and strategic location, was the ultimate prize. Cleopatra knew this. What remained was memory written in stone, buried in tombs, and whispered through time. That's why she didn't just fight with armies, she fought with alliances. First, she aligned with Julius Caesar, bearing him a son. But Rome saw it differently. Cleopatra and Antony's forces were outmaneuvered, outnumbered, and ultimately outmatched. The defeat wasn't just military, it was symbolic. The Roman Senate, led by Octavian, the future emperor Augustus, declared war, not just on Cleopatra or Antony, but on the idea that Egypt could be free. The showdown came at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCIA, naval clash off the coast of Greece. The dream had ended. Back in Alexandria, with Octavian's forces closing in, Cleopatra and Antony took their own lives, romanticized in legend, but tragic in truth. Egypt was no longer the center of the world. It was a trophy. Under Roman rule, Egyptian culture was slowly dying. Temples were left to decay, ancient gods forgotten, yet Cleopatra's legacy endured. To this day, she remains one of the most iconic figures in history, not just for her beauty, but for her defiance. And with her death, the sands closed over Egypt's last breath of freedom. Empires fall, but some never truly vanish. Although the last pharaoh had died, although Rome ruled its soil, Egypt's spirit didn't disappear, it simply changed form. The civilization that once raised pyramids toward the stars left behind something far more enduring than gold or thrones, a legacy that still lives in every corner of our world. The Great Pyramid of Giza remains one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and the only one still standing. For over 4,500 years, it has defied time, weather, and war. It's not just stone, it's a message. Their medical texts describe surgeries, their astronomy tracked the stars, and their mathematics helped them build with precision unmatched for centuries. A silent whisper from the past saying, we were here, and we mattered." Let's start with the obvious, the monuments. But Egypt gave the world more than architecture. They developed one of the earliest language of sacred symbols that preserved everything from royal decrees to intimate love poems. In a world that often seemed chaotic, the Egyptians believed it was their duty to keep the universe in harmony. This wasn't just religion, it was a way of life. But in doing so, it achieved something greater than power. It became eternal. A philosophy that echoed through law, leadership, and daily rituals. And as long as the Nile flows, as long as eyes gaze up at pyramids with awe, Egypt will never be truly gone. And then, there is the idea that shaped their entire worldview. The concept of cosmic balance, justice, and order. Even today, children learn about Tutankhamun before they understand their own country's history. Egypt has become mythic, not just a chapter in a textbook, but a civilization we project our dreams, fears, and questions onto. Even after their fall, Egypt fascinated the conquerors who claimed it. Obelisks were stolen and shipped to Paris, London, and New York. Mummies were unwrapped at parties. Tombs were looted by adventurers who had no idea what they were disturbing. The Greeks, the Romans, and later the Europeans during the 19th century, Egyptomania, tried to claim a piece of Egypt's mystery for themselves. But the magic endured. Cleopatra inspired Shakespeare. The pyramids inspired Newton, and maybe that's the real story here. Yes, Egypt fell, slowly, painfully, like a star burning out. Time may take kings and empires, but it can't erase wonder. So, why did Egypt fall? Was it the Nile's betrayal, the hunger, the civil wars, the foreign invasions? Yes, but those were just pieces of the puzzle. The real reason Egypt fell wasn't a single event or enemy. It was something deeper. Something far more human, a slow forgetting of who they were. Over thousands of years, Egypt built a world based on order, purpose, and cosmic harmony. But with time came complacency. The rituals remained bad, the meaning dimmed. The statues stood but the hearts behind them crumbled. Leaders stopped listening to the land. Priests hoarded power. The divine pharaohs became puppets. And while the monuments stayed strong, the foundations of belief and unity began to crack. But more often, they fade with indifference, with arrogance, with the belief that greatness is permanent. They built wonders that have survived longer than most countries. Their culture shaped humanity's view of time, death, the afterlife, even the soul. Egypt didn't fall in a single battle. It fell in moments of neglect, in years of silence. Still marveling at their achievements, still haunted by their mysteries, in generations of forgetting that even the greatest empires must adapt or die. And isn't that a warning to us all? We tend to think that civilizations collapse with fire and blood. Egypt stood for over 3,000 years. Let that sink in. To put it in perspective, ancient Egypt lasted longer than all of modern history combined. They were ancient to the ancient Greeks, and yet they still fell. But perhaps, in falling, they achieved something no army ever could: immortality. Because here we are, thousands of years later, still talking about them. That's not failure, that's legacy. If this journey through the rise and fall of ancient Egypt moved you, there's more to explore. Hit the subscribe button for cinematic deep dives into the forgotten corners of history. Like, share, and drop a comment below. What do you think is the most powerful lesson we can learn from Egypt's fall? History doesn't repeat itself, but it sure loves to whisper.